Hey, Deanna, you finally got on.
Good morning.
Good
Yeah,
morning.
nice to see everybody.
Yes, well, I went to such great lengths to accommodate the time in the UK, and now I
Oh,
don't see anybody from the UK. So I guess they'll show up or they won't show up.
well, we hope we see them, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
They're-
Deanna, you're connected to a university as well, aren't you?
Actually, I teach at a small college. It's a transitioning from a 2-year college to a 4-year college right now. Um, I've tried a couple of quarters at a university, and I came in on the middle of Jim's comment there, and I have to admit that I much prefer teaching at a small college, a community college, when just in terms of like the lifestyle atmosphere. So, I get that.
Well, that's where Jill Biden is teaching. She's teaching in a community college.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, cool.
So it was really
And
interesting.
she could probably teach anywhere, right?
Right,
So,
no, yeah.
yeah, it may not have the prestige, but it certainly has a much better, community feel to it.
So before we launch into the meeting, I was just curious, Jim, you mentioned that each college or university has some things in common and some things are unique. Can you
Mhm.
name just one or two that you think are unique at North Carolina?
Well, the university is very strongly supported by the state. So North
Mhm.
Carolina has a really excellent university system across the state. And well supported by the state as well, which is not the case everywhere.
When you were in Colorado, you were doing a ton of traveling, I assume mostly to raise money. Do you have to do the same thing here?
Yeah. Yeah, but that's part of the job. But in Colorado, for example, only about 3 or 4% of the budget of the University of Colorado Boulder came from the state.
Right.
So it was entirely a tuition dependent university.
Mhm.
And which, we could talk about this for a while, but it fundamentally changes the sort of the nature of the student body and the nature of the people who can afford to attend. the
Mm.
university. So
Are
it's
you in
not,
Charlotte? Are you in Charlotte?
no, I'm in Chapel Hill.
Okay. I've heard Chapel Hill is wonderful. I love Charlotte, so just a
Well, I know
little.
I've been to Charlotte a couple times now. So it's
Mhm.
like I said, it's a very strong university system across the state. So,
Did you have to move to change jobs?
yeah.
That's so hard. Yeah, that's hard.
We've just had Charlene Stevens join us. I'm really delighted to see you, Charlene.
Mhm.
You're here with us with Jim White, who's the dean at the University of North Carolina, Deanna Pindell, who's in charge of a lot of the outreach for Women Environmental Arts Directory, and Jean Turner, who was formerly at Louisiana State University. And Jean, are you still connected formally, or do you have any active part at the university there?
I have 3 grants.
Good for you.
That's active, by the way. That's active.
Yeah, that's the best possible connection. Give me the money.
It means paperwork.
Oh, well, there's that.
Of course.
So since none of you have met Charlene before, let me just briefly introduce her. Charlene, I assume you can hear us okay, although you're muted. Charlene is a curator. She has done a lot of work with really interesting Black artists who are beginning to, or rather she's beginning to get involved in how they are addressing land use issues. Charlene, is that you? You're a little
Yes,
bit.
it is.
Oh, great, great. And just on Friday, Charlene and I submitted a proposal to the Managed Retreat Conference for Columbia University. And the theme is how Black and Indigenous communities are trying to cooperate with each other to address some of the inequities in managed retreat strategies.
Mm,
the
mhm.
inequities, of course, coming from the government. And it just brought up for me the whole issue of those of us who are primarily coming from the white dominant culture, but really want to work with other communities and
Mhm.
across demographics and in an intersectional manner. Some of the questions that are arising, I know that Charlene was part of a panel that I did for the Managed Retreat Conference 2 years ago. And at that point, it was just beginning to come onto the mainstream radar that there were unique problems with Black and Indigenous communities. And there were people who were becoming quite vocal and concerned about it. Now what I see, and I hope some of the other people that I invited will be able to show up. Now we're at the point where we're actually trying to work out what are the actual conflicts, where are the opportunities, where are strategies beginning to emerge. And so if everybody doesn't mind, I would like to just briefly turn it over to Jean, because I know you've been specifically struggling with the Native populations in the Gulf of Mexico. And since you're very familiar with the government issues there, I wonder if you could just speak to some of the issues that you've encountered and you find particularly challenging in that work.
Good morning, everyone. The I'm working with several tribes in South Louisiana, and also I'm in a national group of tribes that are looking to, it's called the Convergence Grant, and the Convergence is the marginalized American tribal view of how they are part of the world, joining with Western science. And the main obstacle at this point, of course, is that they're marginalized, and trying to affect not only their way of looking at the world, but to introduce it again into the world that's marginalized them. So there is some outside influence going inward, you might say, or maybe allowing the inward to come out. But it's socially, politically, for the tribes, of course, they're facing the similar battles as they've been doing for the last couple hundred years. They don't own the land. They're not part of the political structure. And a little small detail is that until the 60s, they weren't even allowed to go to high school.
Mhm.
And that is, of course, transferred into not being able to go to college because nobody had before. They don't know how to, they didn't know how to do it. Some of them don't even read, and they're 70 now. And they're trying to, like a lot of immigrants that have been here all along and had an immigrant problem, they have a strong sense of community, but they are not well represented politically or socially or economically in the dominant structure. So the other part of that, of course, is that, not of course, but is that it's a learning experience for people from outside who want to help or be engaged in some way to learn without interfering. So you were helpful and without being more or less a patron symbol in terms of the science, because they have their own knowledge about it. But the knowledge about the system, which is a whole ecosystem knowledge, is sometimes viewed as another technological commodity when they engage with Western science. So people come in and colonize it, take the information and go. It's really embedded in this larger worldview. And, you know, the economists, ecological economists these days are calling that a donut and analogy, but really it's all along, it's been part of their worldview. And just one little tidbit on that is when my one of the tribal chiefs would describe what they do when they harvest, because they're basically subsistence people. They say, well, the shrimp, because they're shrimpers, the shrimp didn't give this year. They're not talking about how much they take out. They're talking about how much they receive, which is a very different attitude. It's not extractive. It's part of recognizing your small place in the world and that you're subservient to all the relationships that build around you. And I can't say these tribes have taught me this, but there's in a lot of places, there's no word for wilderness in their vocabulary. Because they're not something outside of you. It's around you. You're part of. It's not something you could distinguish yourself from. So they're part of the web. It's a very ecological view and more than just a natural history view. So
You know, the things you're talking about evoke so many complicated issues. The most salient to me is that this culture has marginalized the people who could most save us all
exactly.
and left them with zero leverage, except through people like yourself, Jean, who really want to help. And it must be a very conflicted position. I was thinking, I was at a luncheon on Friday with the director of the New York Foundation of the Arts, and part of the focus of the luncheon was that he needs to get some of the pressure off him, that all these artists are desperate for money, and he's spending all his time raising money, and he's been doing it for 17 years, and he's increased the budget from 1 point something million to 31 million. Now it's gone down a little bit, but that's an enormous personal pressure for anybody in administration to deal with. Do you feel that kind of pressure?
Well, I'd be lying if I didn't, but there's a Jewish proverb that I can't get it exactly. I mean, it's come through in several varieties, but it's basically, you're not responsible for all the ills in the world, but neither can you neglect them. And
Right.
so the pressure, one way to look at pressure is that you're here and you got to do something. You know, it's not pressure in that sense. It's just something that should come out of you or could come out of you without feeling like you're going to fail, because you may fail. And it's not your fault. You're trying. You just want to do better at it, but you're not going to fail or succeed. You're going to try to resolve whatever the issue is at hand in a natural way that comes up in a good way. So you're causing good trouble, as they say.
I want to go to the issue of art. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. And Charlene, I wonder if you could comment on this issue of how do you bring these issues into the mainstream so that, for example, Indigenous or Black communities have a louder voice at the table, and how do you experience that? And I just want to briefly comment that in the Echo Dialogue, there was just a thread about how do we bring global warming into the forefront of policy concerns. And one of my own comments was the problem with journalism is if it bleeds, it leads. And it's sometimes really hard to get across where the bloodletting is. So Charlene, would you like to speak to that a bit, please?
Well, as far as reaching out and increasing awareness, art has a special power to do that, to reach people in different ways. And I'm not even thinking just about, fine arts, which is in my area, but if you look at genres like literature and television and film, I think that a lot of futurism is dealing with, it's one way to raise someone's awareness is like create a science fiction dystopia. We had, I think that the popular pushback, against the end of Roe. I think that The Handmaid's Tale and Margaret Atwood did a great job of bringing, that issue to light, even though it was kind of updated for today's, struggle with women's body autonomy and et cetera, and misogyny, where the original book was written to help white people be able to empathize with chattel slavery, African chattel slavery, which that point has kind of been missed, with the television series. But if we look at things, I think people have opened their eyes, like disaster movies, and then apocalyptic dystopias, where we really have it really has made the general public be able to imagine, what happens if we don't, if this continues on this path, and what world are we stuck with, and how do we deal with this?
Charlene, I want you to speak specifically to your role as a Black curator, bringing forward the art of people working out of the Black community. And what do you think is the biggest challenge you have in that process?
Well, not all of my work is, with Black
No, of
artists in
course
the
not.
Black community. What I have noticed that is relevant to this is there was a lot of work with Black artists about displacement and gentrification, which are, those are like very relevant topics. I don't know about a challenge in getting the work out. The people that I'm working with, that I have in relation to this forum, are artists and activists. Like not only are they making, sometimes their work is about their activism, sometimes it's art as activism, but in most it's a little of both. And as far as the challenges go, I think that some people every group is making something of their own. And my challenge and what and what I wanted to do with the upcoming talk that was proposed is to bring communities together, for communities to see that they have a common cause, even though they have community specific issues, that there's a common cause. So when I was connecting Black communities and Indigenous communities, because there are common causes of land justice, displacement, and the vulnerability to environmental disaster. But then there's also a history that's not that clean between the two groups.
Right.
Like there's discrimination between the two groups. There are Natalie Ball is an example of an artist. She's a Black person, but she's all and Indigenous, but she had to fight. She had to do some work to be recognized by the Klamath tribe before she could, really, move there and take a leadership position in the tribal council, working to save the Klamath River. And also there were Africans that were on the Trail of Tears because they were enslaved and not being recognized by the nations that enslaved them.
Well, I didn't even know that, Charlene.
Yes.
Pardon my
So
ignorance.
there's a complicated history, and to be able to work through that complicated history and then find commonalities and cooperation is the challenge.
Mhm.
Chris, in the UK, one of the things that's really interesting to me about dealing with the Indigenous issue in the UK is that we don't normally think of white people as Indigenous, but the people of Wales, for example, are clearly Indigenous and clearly have the same kinds of traditional knowledge that we're talking about any group, whether they're in Africa or New Zealand or whatever. Do you want to comment on this theme of how do we find ways to work across demographics so that we have a more inclusive strategy?
That question about indigeneity for me in Scotland, but would be true in Wales. I mean, actually it'd be true in any area where there is some population who are still the population.
Mhm.
And who speak a traditional language which is rooted in place. So actually, certainly Welsh, Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic.
Mhm.
These are languages that are rooted in place and draw on place, specific place, as their metaphor, as their structure. And so, but I mean, so there are people who one would understand as in some way being indigenous across the British Isles, but really not many, for lots of reasons. And that's an issue. But I wanted to pick up on that other point that you were making, Charlene, and I'm sorry, we haven't met before, and it's nice to meet you, and I appreciated the comments you were making. And there was a really interesting podcast that I ended up listening to because my son had us listening to it, which made a point about the difference between Jeremy Corbyn, the socialist leader in the UK, and Bernie Sanders in the US. And the point was that Jeremy Corbyn made his arguments on moral grounds. It's morally bad that people are homeless. We should do something about it. And the podcast made the argument that Bernie Sanders never made moral arguments. He made arguments for shared interest. And the difficulty with moral arguments is that they basically require empathy or sympathy, whereas actually shared interest doesn't require either. You are finding that your interest is the same as somebody else's. And I found that to be a really interesting argument about how we make arguments, what we choose to do, how we choose to make arguments. And then there was a follow-up, another thing we were listening to on the sort of the Black British cultural theorist Stuart Hall and the subject of solidarity. And actually solidarity being precisely in a funny way in situations where there are conflicts between people's interests are not completely aligned. They have different interests, but they choose to form solidarity because there is a greater purpose that there's something which means you need to kind of go, yeah, okay, we've got differences, but there's something to do here. And I found all of that to be really interesting, because in a way we are so often driven into our own echo chambers rather than dealing with common interest and solidarity. And I'll stop at that point because that's it.
You made a really important point that Ed Maybach, the director of the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason, has made in their annual studies of the attitudes of Americans towards climate change, which was, you can't argue somebody into the right position. But what you can do with the furthest right in people is say, hey, this light bulb is cheaper. Why don't you use it? And that simplifies the whole argument completely. Jim, what kinds of demographic issues do you find as someone who has a long history of work on climate change at the University of North Carolina? Do these kinds of questions come up there, and how do you address them?
Yes, of course they do. I'm still chewing on what Chris had to say, which is what I found really, and I find it interesting because this is something that I see growing in the US, is the recognition that some of the groups that have historically been at odds really have common enemies, if you will, and they have common benefits. And there's a great deal of possibility there to get those folks together to actually, push back on those that are pretty blatantly using groups. People in power using groups to their benefit, to the benefit of those in power, but to the detriment of the groups that they're actually using. And
can you be more specific, Jim?
yeah, for example, there's a fairly large segment of the rural poor in America who share common problems with Blacks in America, with the rural white poor who share common problems with Blacks, with other groups, and have natural, there's a lot of natural affiliations there in terms of, our common enemy is not each other. Our common enemy are those who are creating economic barriers to economic growth in our communities. And those groups don't historically get together. They have in the past, quite frankly, but those who would divide, I think, are doing a good job of dividing. And Chris, I'd ask you to to comment on that. I mean, what I see is there are people who have a vested interest in keeping these folks from coming together. And the degree to which they're successful is can, in my opinion, be very frustrating because they are successful. Anyway, so I'm sorry. I forgot the question you actually asked me. But like a good politician, I'm answering a question that you didn't ask. So,
Chris, would you like to comment?
I mean, the divisiveness of some politicians in their own interest is writ large across. I mean, writ large across the past. Across several key points of decision making in both of our countries over the recent past. So I think that arts and culture are largely responsible for the increased importance placed on identity in a way. You think about the history of arts, and there is a reading, you could read the history of sort of late 20th century arts and culture as actually having significantly contributed to the problem by encouraging people to think that their identity and their community, their identity is paramount. I don't, maybe that's unfair, and because in a sense the arts and culture was arguing that it was valuable, not paramount, I think, but actually when played on with populist politicians, it flipped so easily from being valuable to being predominant. Do you see what I'm getting at? That in a
Yeah.
way,
Oh,
there's,
yeah.
you know, that and so I think I mean, all things are good and bad simultaneously. You know, there's nothing that's an unqualified good, and actually there's very few things that are unqualified bads. Most things are, it depends on how what they're being used for, by whom, and to what ends. But I think that in a sense, what appeared to be an incredibly positive direction has been flipped over by populist politicians, and by corporate entities, and by by the proliferation of valuing of choice as an apparent good, into something which means that we have an enormous amount of work to do to rebuild common interest and solidarity in order to be able to actually do some things which are so urgent now, so urgent.
Can we go to Deanna? Because I think what you were just talking about in terms of inclusivity and how we're becoming separated actually relates to the project of the weed work, because that's a very specific agenda to bring women artists forward and give them support. And feminism has been a contested project from the very beginning. Obviously, we can't leave out half the population, but the minute you bring in another group to an established population, everybody's antenna goes up. It's like, oh God, they're going to take something away from me. So how do you think weed has addressed the problem of how do you begin to carve a place for yourself in the culture, if in any way you've been marginalized in the past?
You know, part of it for weed is that they've been grappling with these issues that the organization started 25 years ago, with a really specific agenda. And I think over the years, they've grown as a lot of feminism has grown in terms of really trying to feature women of color and promote women of color, and make a safe space for women of color. You know, and of course, there's been moments where it's fraught, but overall, I think that the culture of weed is very much in favor of recognizing that the voices of marginalized people need to come forward. And so just on a very personal level, that's one of the things I like about working there, is that recognition. And I see a really consistent effort to reach out and bring in women of different marginalized groups and support their work and feature their work. And in the sense that people who are white or dominant culture really need to just pay attention to the fact that we need to be humble and step back and not try to make space for ourselves in the front all the time. So you know, and we're doing more of that. We're developing a website so that we can do more shows, like one that Manoush Zomorodinia did the year before last, where she had collected a group of Iranian women from where she came from, and did a show where there was a show there in Iran, and an online show that Manoush put together with Iranian American women in her region, well, and probably other places in the country, but she knows people in the California Bay Area. So that's a big deal right now for us. We're desperately trying to raise money to enhance our website, and so that we can do a lot more of that kind of work. But I would also really like to ask Charlene a question based on the discussions that have been, some of the things you guys have raised so far, which is coming back to the ideas of language and of solidarity. And we've just talked a little bit about how, we actually, all of us, everybody who's not part of the vested interest class, but especially marginalized peoples, we need solidarity against the vested interest. But I'm wondering if, Charlene, do you feel, you talked about your challenging issue being the question of bringing Indigenous and Black people together in spite of the challenges historically between the two groups. And I'm wondering if you think it's easier or more successful to try to create solidarity against a vested interest. Like we're talking about what is self-interest, or solidarity maybe parallel to vested interests, like, just creating alternative spaces. I hope that question is clear. Let me know if I need
Well,
to.
why can't we have both? When I'm thinking of solidarity, and I believe we need solidarity and empathy, because solidarity only goes so far with
Mhm,
shared interests, but
mhm,
there also needs to be a space for respecting and supporting interests that have nothing to do with you.
mhm, mhm,
And when I mentioned the Native and Black thing, also Indigenous people can look at like Black people like, you were used to help steal our land. There's two sides, and there's
right.
also a history of cooperation.
Mhm,
So but I'm looking at there was an example when we're talking about populism, and that at the moment the right, causing, tribalism and divisions, and I saw one example was agricultural policy, where when the Biden administration came in, we wanted to right or wrong that farm subsidies and land, where only people that benefited by those were white people, and a lot of Black farmers, as a result, historically, have lost more and more land every year.
mhm,
Now, Black farmers and white farmers both have a common interest in pushing back against big agriculture, which is
Mhm.
trying to take everybody's land.
mhm,
But when this attempt to right a wrong for Black farmers, who there are a lot less of, who are in more danger of disappearing, the white farmers cried foul and said, "How dare you do this for them and not us?"
mhm,
And when I think of white allyship,
mhm,
it's not just, I think a lot of white allyship is being in the position of power and being the dominant culture and being the group of people that have received all of the benefits at the expense of others,
mhm.
that is not just listening, and when working with groups, also letting those groups speak for themselves, but also to be willing to give something up, or to be willing to have everything not benefit you.
Mhm.
And I think this is where we've had, this country has had a very difficult time. And then like someone was talking about, the powers that be using one group against the other. Well, I see that in using conservative attorneys and using Asian American college applicants against Black applicants when they're fighting, when they're not fighting for the same spaces. The actual spaces of these Asian American applicants are, to be looking at the white applicants.
Mhm.
They're the ones that are taking all the spaces, not that one or two Black applicant that gets in.
Mhm.
When there are thousands of white applicants that they're not fighting. But they found a way to get, two other people fight, two people fighting each other, for this zero-sum game, tiny slice of pie thing, where like 80% of the pie, no one's looking at.
Charlene, I want to go back to the farming issue because I'm trying to remember some of the arguments that I heard about where indigenous peoples
Well,
were.
this wasn't an indigenous thing. This was like
I
white
understand.
farmers upset about Black farmers
I
getting
understand. I
anything.
understand. But I remember when this came up and from my indigenous friends, what I was hearing was, hey, what about us? All our land was taken away. In the artists that you've worked with, and I know you've worked with artists who are either both Black and indigenous, or they represent each group, what did they say about the intersectionality between the concerns of Black farmers and indigenous groups?
I didn't get into that part of that argument with that policy. So I really don't have anything for you right now on that.
I want to go back to Jean for a minute. This seems to me to be the hardest part of this kind of conversation. How does each group get fairly represented? So people talk about reparations to Black people or reparations to indigenous people, and then the whole thing devolved into some sort of squabble about dollars and cents that goes nowhere. Where do you see hope for commonality between the various groups coming out of your work with indigenous people in the Gulf of Mexico? Jane, you're muted.
Maybe I should be. I like this comment that Chris made about distinguishing between the moral and the shared argument.
Mhm.
And I guess they can be merged so that one becomes superficial and dominant to the other within the other. I mean, you can have a shared interest argument of the dominant majority that overtakes the moral argument. And I think foundationally, the moral argument, the kind of actual shared moral argument, always in the end is the position we want to take for ourselves and each other, whether we realize it or not. So I think, in the end, in the good end, at some point, we are going to be a whole tribe that see things coming up and devolves at the right time and place easily rather than having to fight about it.
Mhm.
And we do that out of a shared appreciation for our human nature. Now that may sound, it is idealistic, but in the end, that's the direction we have to aim at. I can see the shared argument being successful in incorporating that, but I can see it being unsuccessful by having a shared, dominant viewpoint that squashes the minority. So I don't know, trying to get back to your question, if that it touches on some of that. But I think we have to always, in this group or groups like this, we always have to keep in mind the moral argument is foundational. And I think the shared government is a moral argument in many ways, but it can be superficial in other ways if we're not consummate aware of the moral argument.
Jim
If-
has escaped, but
Yeah.
I wanted to ask him, and it's too late now. Maybe if I'd asked him earlier, he couldn't have escaped. But one of the things that nags at me a lot is how Putin was trained by the KGB, and their whole agenda is to create division in demographic systems so that they topple. I keep wondering, with all the divisiveness that we're going through, particularly in the USA and the UK, does Putin have a hand in this? And Jim, I know, knows enough about what's going on with the military that he might have been able to answer it. Jean, do you have any speculation about that, or does it just sound like wild conspiracy theories?
Well, everything's interrelated, and so I just as I was reading the thing by Isaiah Berlin about Russian history, about this one author. It was really insightful, but it was about the history of Ivan Turgenev in the 1850s, 1900 period, and it sounded just like today. That Russia's history and political attitudes and Tsarism was just like it is today, and Putin's just one of those characters.
Great.
Sorry. And so I don't know how, there's a long history of avoiding those things and of slaughtering other people. And Ukraine was, of course, central to the slaughter of, Stalin, was it 30 million or 3 million people died of hunger in Ukraine at the end of Stalin. And, they're doing it again.
I want to go back now to my comment earlier about if it bleeds, it leads, and how do you get these stories into the press? And what I'm thinking of is the show that Monica Fabjanska recently did of Ukrainian women artists. And that got a lot of press because it was from the Ukraine. So I hate to think of it in these terms, but is the only way to get attention to show the blood? Do you think that's the case, Deanna, and what you've experienced with weed, or Charlene, do you want to comment, or Chris, anybody on that issue?
I'll let Charlene go first if she's got a comment.
Well, I mean, why is it that no one really cared about Black people until we were till there's video of us getting shot by the police all the time?
Mhm.
I mean, the issues were already there.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah, the media, there's so many factors, and I think, like, just terrifyingly, we see people like DeSantis, who those of you not in our country, it looks like one of our leading, most racist governors ever, most Trumpian governors ever, is getting ready to run for president on even more explicitly racist programs than Trump himself was. And I think that's terrifying. And that came up because one of the things he's doing in Florida is he made it illegal to literally to teach a high school AP class on African-American history. And so it's like, if most of the country is absolutely ignorant due to a lack of education, which is, at least in the public school system, then yeah, how is it, that makes it pretty difficult to develop white allyship when a lot of people just don't even realize, due to poor education, what's going on. So, I mean, that's one piece of the puzzle.
It's a big piece of the puzzle, I think.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many people. I teach a class in Northwest Coast Native American art history, and it's just kind of stunning at how many of the students are like, I had no idea. They're really excited to learn, but they're also kind of appalled to realize that they had no idea, as they should be, not in a negative way. But yeah, it's not happening in our schools, and it's one place where it really needs to happen.
Chris, I know a lot of things are getting dismantled in the UK. Lately, I've been following the whole crisis with healthcare there. And I know that there are a lot of conflicts over education. I came across that when I was doing my dissertation, and it was coming out of the University of Plymouth in the UK. What is the status now of the kind of educational curricula that people are getting there?
Conflicted, like everywhere. I don't think, I suspect it's pretty much, I mean, I don't think we have anything as drastic as what's going on in the States, actually, in terms of books being banned by school boards and so on. There's nothing at that level of insanity in the UK, but I think that you know, education is a site of significant conflict. A colleague of mine, who you might know, Sophie Hope. Well, anyway, she you know, Birkbeck, which is a higher education institution that was set up. I suspect, I understand that the new school was also intended to be focused on adult education and outreach. You know, Birkbeck was set up as an institution absolutely intended to be focused on doing things in a way that made it accessible to non-traditional communities, much higher proportion of adult learners, and all of this sort of stuff. And it has a senior management at the moment that's more interested in purchasing glamorous properties, and cutting down on its staffing. And she's asking, I mean, it's a really interesting question. Can we take this institution over and run it as a collective? Which is
Very interesting.
and it's a really interesting, important question, for which there is, as far as I can understand, literally no mechanism, unless you could persuade the governors to do that. You know, actually, you suddenly realize that higher education institutions are constituted by and large as along corporate lines, as are most arts organizations. And therefore, actually, they are not open to revision.
Right.
Actually, they're not open to being actually seriously challenged, and revised. So, and I, you know, there's a lot of conflict about around decolonial education and all of these things, but actually the structures are ill suited to the challenges. It's the short answer. That the structures are ill suited to the challenges. Yeah, that's all. I mean, I don't think I've got anything useful to say.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, and I want to invite anybody who'd like to comment further on this topic of how do we work across demographics to see the kinds of change we all need. Charlene or Jean, do you want to say anything further?
I'll pop in. Well, just to end it. So I think solidarity and empathy for, you know, things that don't directly involve yourselves is a good start. I think someone mentioned, you know, not from the colonial patron kind of relationship, but a relationship of equals and, not speaking for people, but letting the voices be heard. And a lot of listening. And also the main thing is, I think the big hurdle is being willing to give something up.
Mhm.
I think that's where most of us have, hit the wall.
I think you're right. And the thing about Indigenous culture that's particularly striking to me is that wealth is expressed by what you give to the community, not what you take from the community. And I think that becomes the crux of where a lot of cultural conflict arises, at least specifically between Indigenous peoples and the dominant culture. That, as Gene said about his experience with the tribes in the Gulf of Mexico, they're used to the experience of white scientists coming in, extracting knowledge, and then leaving. And the story of Thanksgiving is that the tribes came and gave everybody all this food, and then the colonists killed them. It's oversimplification, but basically that's it.
Before we go, I would like to ask Charlene, if I would like to follow your work, and if you have any examples from your curatorial research about, socially engaged projects or particular artist projects that you've seen that you think are really successful examples of, the kind of change we're talking about, or how can I follow your work?
Oh, well, I have a gallery and publication, which we haven't really published anything lately. It's arcadeprojectzine.com. This is actually, I haven't done much socially engaged, I've been driven to do it lately. So I don't think there's not much on there. I'm on it right now.
Okay, that's cool.
More to be revealed, huh?
Yep. I'm working on my own art project. I really, working with you, Aviva, building on this topic of discussion, and I'm working on some art journalism about. So yeah, the socially engaged part is really 2023, I think, is a year for that.
At least. Well, it's been as always, a great pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much for the honor of your participation. I hope everybody came away with a few thoughts that are useful, and perhaps we can convene again in the future.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for the invite.
Thank
Great.
you.
And it is recorded, so I will pass the recording around as soon as we have it.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. Thank you, all of
Thank you
you.
all.
Really very interesting.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.